Welcome to the Action Network podcast. I am your host, Evan Abrams, and I am joined by my colleague, Action Network's NFL betting expert and the podcast host here, Chris Raybon. Well, first of all, Raybon, what's up? How are you? And then we can kind of get into the 2025 NFL draft. I mean, I can't believe it. Crazy it's here.
Yeah, Evan, what's going on? And I'm doing great. I mean, this is the first podcast, or one of the few that I've been in a while at Action where I'm not hosting. So I just have to make an outline. I mean, I'm just trying to enjoy the good life right here.
We're trying to make it easy on you, Raybon. I mean, we understand it's the off season. We know everyone's busy, but here, listen, we're going to talk about the combine. We're going to hit on off-season topics, stats, all things related to the NFL. But to me, I kind of want to toss it to you first here. We're going to have tons of episodes when it comes to these drafts for the next 9 weeks, leading up to the draft 2025 in Green Bay on April 24th. But I just kind of want to start with the draft itself. Like, this is a completely different animal than, say, traditional betting, futures. Like there's a lot that goes into this that doesn't go into the modeling on game to game and things like that. So just start it off. Like, what's your approach when you're betting the draft?
Well, the first thing, I think it's important to look for spots to be contrarian, but in a smart way. Like, the biggest thing I think is there's a lot of hive mind, right? Because you're gonna have your popular mockers, your Mel Kipers and your Dane Bruglers and guys like that, Daniel Jeremiah, and most people betting are gonna just have read one of their mocks or a few of their mocks, so those are going to be overly priced into the market. I think the best way to look at the draft is every draft is going to be different, so you want to get a wide range of opinions because that's going to kind of mirror 32 different teams' decision making. So I like to look at, something like NFL Mock Draft Central. They have all the mock drafters and they kind of take like a consensus of them. And you could see, how many people, what percentage are picking this X player at pick 1 and pick 2 and this and that. So you kind of want to look at range of outcomes a little more and don't really lock in on like, okay, well, Mel Kiper thinks like this is the top 3. So that's what I think too. Another few other tips I would say is, don't confuse what a team should do with what they will do. There's a lot of team needs. That's the buzzword that goes around a lot in the offseason. A lot of team needs articles. And, that doesn't necessarily mean the team is looking at it the way whoever wrote that article is. So kind of, you want to kind of think past that. Find markets where there's a high upside to be a little bit contrarian. I think, things like team to draft a certain position first. A lot of times, especially outside the top 2 or 3 picks, there will be kind of a consensus draft order, and whatever position that player that's the consensus pick would be for that team, he'll have these juiced up odds. And then something that might make the second most sense will have like long odds, up plus juice, and you can make some good profit kind of betting those kind of things. A first player taken out of position. I remember a few years ago, we were all over Henry Ruggs being the first wide receiver taken. It was him, I think Judy and somebody else. And it was kind of, there was a consensus. I think Judy was expected to go first, but it wasn't that crazy. But yet Ruggs was like 6-1. So try to find situations like that where you're not really going out on a limb, but you are just admitting that the consensus choice or the most likely thing is not necessarily likely to happen. We know these teams do not think the way a lot of prognosticators do. I mean, we've seen the Raiders go way off the board in the past. Every year there's a few teams that just go way off the board or do something crazy. So I would say kind of keep an open mind. Non-elite quarterbacks, like after you have your top guys, non-elite quarterbacks tend to be overvalued. They tend to go later than expected. So if you're betting things like an over-under for a quarterback, I usually bet them to go later because the books control who they list. So generally, if you see, there's only going to be so many players listed with those over-under, draft pick numbers. So if you like to bet those, tend to go later, because like the book can control who they list, and everyone's optimistic. Like, don't be too optimistic this time of year. Like, try to say, okay, but what else could happen? And don't make bets on specific picks too far out. Like, if we're talking today, I don't think you want to try to nail down like the exact who's going to be the number 4 pick or whoever pick, because free agency, trades, combine, even a lot of that, like things could change a lot. And just one trade, for example, or one poor combine performance or whatever can create a whole kind of butterfly effect. So those would be the things I kind of look for. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it. I think the three things I look at is like, what type of draft is this? Like, is there talent only at the top? Like, I think trying to get an idea, and that's reading articles and, going through tweets and going through information, and also doing some self scouting, right? And being like, if I were to combine the last three drafts, where would some of these players be? How, top heavy is it? Do I think there's going to be more? So I think doing a lot of that work ends up kind of telling you what, I hate using this word, but like what you think they might do, because in the end, that's what you're
Yes.
trying to accomplish
Yes.
here. I think the other one is GM tendencies. So I do think, and not just GMs, I think it's worth reading who is actually in the room helping make the pick and trying to get an idea of what they kind of tend to do, which sometimes is the GM, and in other times it's a little bit more confusing. And then going to your beat writer aspect, I think following it's list season is the way I like to call it, is following a larger list of beat writers, but then trying to figure out and narrow down, who is better in what spots. This guy understands the Browns, this person's very good in the NFC North. Like, there's certain things like that you tend to pick up on, even if it's your first year doing it. Just following along on a daily basis, I think you start to get some of those approaches. So, and I think there's some great stories out there, like the Will Levis going from 40-1 to 4-1, and obviously not being picked first overall. Like, we have seen tons of different examples of just random steam at random times and random news.
Yes.
So to me, that is 100% the thing to pay attention to and avoid. But I want to talk two more questions and then we can kind of move on here. So I want you to answer prospect tape and mock drafts. So how do you look at some of these prospects? What's your, tools you look into to try to differentiate? And are you going to do a mock yourself? Like, what are we dealing with here?
So I'll answer the prospect tape first, because I think that's always an interesting question. In terms of the general, like, stats versus film debate, I'm a both guy. Like, I think both are helpful. Sometimes film tells you something that would take a long time to figure out with stats. Sometimes stats tell you something that would take a long time to figure out with film. That being said, I do watch more film once a guy is already in the NFL. I just think that's more relevant. So, but I do watch prospect tape. However, I watch it probably, I would think, more on the casual side, is in terms of, I'm not really breaking down all 22. What I'm just trying to do is get a sense of get a sense of guys, their game speed, just guys that stand out, how they look on film going against other top schools. So I like to watch top schools going against each other, the schools with the most prospects, and so I can kind of see a bunch of guys
like
at once.
that.
But yeah, I'm focusing mostly, like, I shouldn't say mostly, but I'm focusing a little heavier on offensive skill positions. Number one, because just during the season when you're betting, you're betting props. That's usually, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. So it kind of goes into just what the work I'll be doing in the offseason. I mean, in the regular season and fantasy as well. So that's how I'm kind of looking at it. So I am watching these guys, but I have been a big, like, all 22 breakdown guy, and I found it didn't help me at all. So with draft prospects. So
sure.
I'll watch it a little bit after, like, if I'm trying to get a sense of, after the draft, that is, if I'm trying to get a sense of, okay, why did a team take this player? What did they see in terms of how he might be used, how he might fit into what they already have going on? Then I think it's a bit more relevant. But just trying to watch all 22 prior to the draft hasn't really helped me personally. So I'm bigger on just kind of getting a sense of them. And then as far as, doing mocks, I don't do a mock myself. I think there are people that put a lot more, have a lot more knowledge in that area. Like, I don't consider myself a quote unquote draft expert. Like, I know these guys, but I think, my specialty is still NFL, futures, regular season, fantasy, all that kind of stuff, week to week betting. But what I will say is I usually have kind of a list, and it's like range of outcomes. So I might have, okay, for pick one, this person, like Cam Ward, 70%, Shador, 20%, Travis Hunter, 10%. Like, that's how I kind of look at the draft. I don't think anything's for certain. So I'm just trying to find range of outcomes for each pick, and then find markets where I can take advantage of that, where a certain outcome might be a little over or undervalued. But I do look at a lot of other mock drafts. I like to look at, again, like consensus mock drafts, not to find that one consensus pick, but to see all of the different potential picks that, people who do, put their kind of blood, sweat, and tears into this all year long, where they're kind of looking at it. Because I like to get a difference of opinion. I think that's so important, getting a difference of opinion, because I think a lot of people, again, the biggest mock drafters, I think have an outsized effect on the market. So you talk about your Kuipers, your Jeremiahs, your Bruglers, guys like that. Everyone's going to read those guys, but there's a lot of people who, are mock drafting. There's like hundreds of people that, some of them are really good. They might have a better sense once you look at just the entire spectrum of the potential players that could be selected at each pick in the order. They give you a much better idea. I think the guys that you can read just going to ESPN or wherever, that's already priced in. You're not going to really find anything special. I think that's probably how the books are pricing most of these. They're not going to spend too much time pricing these. These are still like Super Bowl props or things like that.
I mean, to me, the most interesting thing you said is that the big boys, the Kuipers, the people in that area, even McShay, people who do all that work, tend to move the lines. And doesn't mean they're always right, because sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But the other ones in a consensus, I think kind of give me the big picture. Like, I want to know of the top 25, okay, 23 have this person going here, but what do the other two even think? Like, because to me, it's not that I'm going to listen to all information, but I think it's good to get a lot of the information and then figure out which ones you kind of want to act on. The only thing I'll say about tape, I tend to use it only to rank in position. So like if I'm having a difficulty like ranking wide receivers in terms of what I think in terms of talent, I tend to go to tape sometimes to give me a little bit of a picture maybe I can't see in like the separation stats or anything like that on paper. So and I think the other interesting thing before we get into the number one pick, we're going to talk about the quarterbacks and such, is just be careful in terms of like the different draft markets, right? So if you like Will Johnson to go top 5, but you also like him to go 5 to the Jaguars, like there's just different markets to attack your theory. So definitely make sure you're like shopping each of the books to do the digging to see which of the different lines are available and find the one that matches what you're trying to accomplish most, I think is the best way I would attack it.
Absolutely.
All right, let's do it. Number one pick in the draft. So obviously we are a bit far out now. I can only see about 3 markets that are kind of up in this area, which is who is going to go first overall. And then there's a market for the team to draft first, and then the first quarterback drafted, which that third market only really interesting if you think that Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, like someone like that has a shot at 1. But I kind of open up the floor to you before I give a thought or two here. Obviously, super early and not tons of markets, but Cam Ward, minus 140, minus 150. He's the odds-on favorite to go first overall. Do you think that's right? And what are your thoughts?
I think it is. I think when you look, so for the number one pick, you got Cam Ward. He's around minus 140. You got Abdul Carter at plus 175. Travis Hunter plus 550. Shador is around plus 750. So I think Cam Ward at that price probably gets shorter than longer because, right now we are still far out. And like I said, you don't want to, there's no short things in the draft and a lot can happen. But when I just look at, like, for example, let's look at the first quarterback drafted. Now you have Cam Ward at minus 275, Shador at plus 200, and then Jackson Dart is 25 to 1, and Milroe and Ewers are 60 to 1 or greater. So really, you're talking Cam and Shador. I think most teams have Cam. Shador, he's not going to really do a true combine or anything like that. So I don't think that's going to really change too much. And then I look at the teams. Tennessee minus 275 to draft at that first pick, which means essentially they don't trade out or anything like that. And then you have, teams that could potentially trade there, like Vegas, the Giants or whatnot. I just don't see Tennessee, if they stand pat, passing over a quarterback. And I think they would have Cam Ward higher than Shador. And then I also don't think anyone who trades to number 1, I don't think they do it for any reason other than to draft a quarterback. So that, like, I think there's, there could be teams that trade up. Maybe Travis Hunter throws a wrench in it. I think he's the only other one that I would say maybe you take a long shot on at number 1 pick at plus 550, because I think there's that allure of the, two-way athlete that, we just haven't seen in a while. But I just can't see Tennessee not taking a quarterback there, and I can't see any team that trades up to there not taking a quarterback, and thus, and I think Cam Ward is going to be the pick over Shador. So that to me is still the market with the most value. But these are another thing I should say, and you kind of alluded to it, Evan, is these are the chalk markets, right? Like these are the markets everyone wants to bet and get right. Like you don't have to bet these markets. Like there's so many other markets where you could kind of, if you have a contrarian viewpoint or something, you'll probably get better odds. But just based on these three, kind of the most popular ones, I'd say Cam Ward's odds are likely to get shorter than longer.
Yeah, if I'm making a bet now, it's Ward in that 140 slot that I see, minus 140 in terms of number one. My reasoning kind of is pretty simple. I don't feel like the top of this class compares well to other classes, which says to me, if Tennessee's going to trade the pick, they're going to trade it to someone who really, really, really loves something at the top of the draft that they're going to want to take, and they're going to give Tennessee enough to give the pick away. And I just don't see that. I don't see the player there that's going to, A, give them enough to trade it, and B, take them away from taking the quarterback when, I mean, I understand it's not a betting point of view and they don't care, but they went 2-15 against the spread last year. They were absolutely god terrible. And I think they need, A, to sell tickets, and B, a guy like Cam who is, he's electric in his own right. I think he's different than Shedeur, and I think his size and certain aspects of his game are going to make teams prefer him. So that's probably the angle that I would take. If I were to get crazy and say, okay, if they were to trade the pick, should we take a chance on one of these teams to draft number one overall? I'm not telling you to lay minus 275 because, again, I'd rather lay the minus 140. But, I mean, a team like the Saints or a team like the Raiders, to me, might make the most sense to splash up and take Cam. So, I mean, obviously one's 5-1 and one's 60-1, two very different situations, but that's the way I look at the market on, February 24th, 25th, right?
I would throw in, I would say Cleveland's 25-1.
They're going to move up one spot though? What do you think?
That's my, hear me out. The Cleveland is 25-1 and the Giants are 6-1. I just don't know if, because you kind of mentioned it, there's not an overwhelming guy that Cam Ward is the top quarterback, but I don't know if teams are going to like him enough. But if they are, the only way I see Tennessee making a trade is if they still get one of those top, 3 or 4 picks. I can't see Tennessee trading, down to 9 or 10. I just think that would be brutal for that franchise. I just don't think they would pass on a quarterback, trade out of the top 5 or whatever. Not now they could, there could be a bunch of trades and they trade out and trade back in. But again, that's what makes the draft, so difficult and opens up for a long shot. But I actually would look at those top 2 teams because, again, the masses don't think that's going to happen. The Giants are 3rd on the list, but they're 6-1. That's decent odds. And then the Browns are 5th at 25-1. So it's still top 5. They're not out of the realm, but their odds are good. So that's the teams I actually look for. Again, that's how I tend to think of things like right now is, no one really knows anything and everyone's kind of going off the consensus, and because even some of these popular mocks, they'll have trades, some won't, but I just can't see Tennessee trading down and missing out on all of those top prospects. So that's why I think, a team like the Giants or Cleveland could very well be involved.
Yeah. I don't mind that at all. I mean, I think about it and say to myself, well, trading from 2-1, but Cleveland's a mess. And, if they're going to find something they like that they think they're going to want to replace Deshaun with in a year or so, I guess it could make sense there. All right. Well, that's the number 1 pick. That's the draft kind of at the moment right now. So I think it's probably good to move forward to just some of the offseason stuff. And we're going to touch on the draft kind of in each of these categories because how could you not with some of this? But we're going to start with the QB needy teams. So 32 teams in the NFL, but definitely all of them don't need quarterbacks. So I kind of did this exercise. I'm sure you did as well. But at the current moment, given the rumors, the trades, the Staffords, the things, the weird stuff, how many quarterbacks, how many teams right now need a quarterback? So I'll let you start. Where's your head at in this discussion?
I count 9 teams. So okay. I think Tennessee, Cleveland, Giants, those are the top 3. Vegas at 6, the Jets at 7, the Saints at 9, Pittsburgh, I count them. And then not everyone will agree. I say the Indianapolis Colts need a quarterback as well. and then the Rams would be that ninth team if Matthew Stafford got traded. Where's your count?
Yeah, so we agree on I'll go AFC first. Jets, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Tennessee, Vegas are, I think, the easy 5. And then after that, I tend to agree with you with Indy. They were on my list. They're talking about bringing in a veteran anyway. So I think there is like competition aspects of that quarterback room. And then the one I wrote down, which is definitely not true now, but I feel like they're thinking about what's next, is Miami. Tua is the guy at the moment, but I feel like I also wanted to write down on this list if I thought a team was going to get overwhelmed and they were willing to maybe do something we weren't seeing. I put a ... in another team, and that was Miami. NFC, Giants. So I think Minnesota's on the list just because I think they're deciding on what to do. I think they probably have their quarterback, but I think there's some decisions to be made there. New Orleans, and then the Rams are kind of deciding what to do in one sense because they're deciding to get rid of Stafford. So it would basically kind of create an opening. And that's kind of it. Like the other ones I had on my list, I don't really think kind of involve themselves in this conversation, which would be like a Seattle and a Dallas, because I think they're both very settled with Geno and Dak, at least for this year. So I think that conversation's a bit aside. So that's the way I broke it down. But I do think what's interesting is it's kind of all the teams that we mentioned. I don't think any of them are less than like 30-1 to win the Super Bowl. So it's really a take your shot of these long shots here.
Yeah, and I know you've done some great work kind of looking at, and we'll probably talk about this a little more in depth, but there's kind of a cutoff even to what teams are true contenders for the Super Bowl. I think it's around like 12-1 or something, and these odds could obviously change, but I think the only teams that you could see even jumping into that list if they have a great offseason would be probably of the ones that we mentioned would be the Rams and yeah, I mentioned Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh potentially. But the thing about the AFC, when you're looking for Super Bowl odds, I never really get excited because I'm like, all right, if a team could, like, let's say if the Commanders are in the AFC, I mean, you still have to get past, Mahomes, Allen, Lamar, Burrow. I mean, it's just so tough. And, the Texans, now they fired Slowick. Maybe they bounce back if they, can get a couple of guys who can block for CJ. Like, there's like a line, a waiting line in the AFC, whereas in the NFC, you could see a team like Washington ascend from like first to the NFC, or the last to the NFC Championship game because there's just not as much competition, and one team like the Niners suffers a lot of injuries that leaves like one or two true contenders, and then one of them gets upset, and next thing you know, you have like a Washington on the precipice of a Super Bowl. So I think the NFC is generally where I look at just. I kind of pay more attention to these NFC teams, and that would be so the Rams kind of stick out there because it's kind of tough to see what their thinking would be if they move on from Stafford because there's not that many options out there for them that would make them better than they were with Stafford. But their team, like I like the way their defense developed. They obviously have talent on the offensive side and a great coach who's been there and done that a couple of times. So the Rams would be a team I'm watching. If they could, if depending on, I mean, even if Stafford comes back, I thought he looked pretty good down the stretch, but I mean, maybe they're trying to get ahead of this. So interesting to see what happens with the Rams.
Yeah, I think the Rams are the right call. I see them 32-1 right now. I mean, I also think there's probably a Cooper Kupp gets traded. Everyone thinks it means something, and that goes to 35-1, 30. Like I feel like there's still like a potential bump up before something major happens in that team that you could even wait it out a tiny bit. The other one again is Minnesota, also at 32-1. I do feel like whatever is going to happen there, yeah. Maybe the hardest division we've ever seen in our lives, but I'm staying in the NFC and believing that like the overall collection of talent on that team is still worthy of somewhat in that slot. The crazy thing is, and you mentioned with the NFC, AFC, you don't hit another AFC team. Miami's 42-1, but Pittsburgh's at 80-1. So that is really like that is really the next one you hit on this list, which kind of tells to your point that like the NFC is one injury away, and you don't know what the Lions are going to be in that slot. So I do feel like that is the conference of opportunity, I'll call it. You have a team at the bottom here in red, which I actually thought about as well. They are one of the longer odds, but they're in the NFC. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the Giants, I think when you're talking about just teams that need a quarterback. We saw Washington, what they did last year. We know, first of all, we know that no team wins the NFC East twice in a row. So Philly, watch out. You're going to get a whole bunch of Niners injuries or something. I'm just kidding. I think they still have the best roster in probably the league. But you look at the Giants, I think that's the team that could ascend the most quickly if they get a quarterback, because you look at the Giants, if they get a quarterback, they have a coach that, I know he was maligned in Brian Daboll, but still an offensive-minded coach that's worked with some good quarterbacks. So I think it wouldn't be like a Caleb Williams and Eberflus situation. You'd actually have an offensive coach. You'd feel good about that. And like we saw it with the Commanders, a lot of those holes on the roster can go away, or at least, that they look like holes. They can go away if you have a quarterback and, you kind of piece it together with some veterans. I mean, the offensive line for the Giants, if Andrew Thomas is healthy, and it might not be as bad as it's been in past years. I think they cobbled together decent play down the stretch even without him at times. They still got some guys on that defensive line. They do have holes in the secondary, but again, so did a team like Washington. So I do think the Giants are interesting, but the thing that holds me back on really ever investing into the Giants is I just have no respect for their ownership. I think their ownership is one of those ownership groups that just meddles, and that's to kind of blame for the lack of success that the Giants have had over the years, even when at times they have been kind of a trendy pick to, ascend quickly or get back to where they were. So the Giants are, I think, if you're just saying who could ascend quickly, the Giants do stand out. Let's say Shador turns into a Jaden Daniels type level talent. I'm not saying he will. I'm just saying you never know. Like, you can't. Nothing's a certainty, but
it's what you're betting on.
Right? Yeah, the Giants with the right quarterback, you would be surprised how quick they could ascend. But at the same time, be aware that the Giants have one of the worst ownership groups, if not the worst, in the NFL. Maybe they're not looking at Madden ratings. Maybe they should be looking at Madden ratings. That's how bad they are at times.
I mean, but to say to your point, the Giants, I believe, were close to like 300 or 400 to 1. They're down to 200 to 1. But you look at the Super Bowl odds in terms of just the NFC, Giants at 200 to 1. Then it's New Orleans at 120 to 1. And then you get to Dallas at 55 to 1. That's it. Like, in terms of actual shots that are really long in that conference, I think there's something there. Now, obviously 300, 400s are a better number. You could shop out there, but I kind of like the roster. Obviously, Neighbors is a massive, massive talent that would love to have a good, decent wide receiver. And I think you'd want a decent wide receiver next to him and a quarterback, which I think you could get more talent into the building. So I think the Giants are just an interesting flyer. So I agree.
Yeah, they're a team to watch, but definitely pay attention to their offseason moves because, number one, it's, obviously Mara, he's been just, that ownership group just hasn't worked out, since the good old days. And then, also, I thought Joe Shane kind of exposed himself and his thought processes behind a lot of decisions, and it didn't really reflect well upon him in that Hard Knocks last year. So, there would be more than just. It's almost like there would be more than just a quarterback that it would need for the Giants to convince me. Like, I'd have to see a lot of moves they made around that quarterback that look smart to me and say, okay, maybe they've turned a corner, maybe they're figuring some things out because that team, it's just been the same story with them.
But the way Shane got exposed kind of tells me there might be a chance, or maybe a greater than 50% chance of doing a splash, because he kind of wants to, get himself back in the good graces. So we'll see. Let's talk about Rodgers and Stafford, because right now those are kind of the two elder statesman-esque quarterbacks who could be on the move soon. I could say how much in general do either of these guys matter, and we'll start there. Like, compare the two if you can.
I don't think Rodgers moves the needle anymore. Granted, the Jets ended up, they looked like they were a quarterback away. They obviously ended up having a lot more issues than the quarterback. But I just think the current level of Aaron Rodgers is not a guy moving the needle. I think Stafford is kind of on that cusp. I think, but the thing with Stafford is I think he probably moves the needle the most for the team he's already on, the Rams, because, we saw it happen. He goes there, the first year he goes there, they win a Super Bowl, and he was already old then. And at times it looks like he really can't handle pressure. But strangely enough, I thought down the stretch he actually moved in the pocket better than I've seen him move in the pocket some of these other seasons, and even including his Super Bowl winning season. So I would say Stafford still probably has that potential, but really, I mean, you're looking at the Rams, and I still say the Steelers. I know they're talking about still choosing between Russ and Fields, but I still think the Steelers, given that floor you have with Mike Tomlin, where they're always at 500 or better, given that defense, if they can keep those guys, their key guys together on defense, you know, I think the Steelers would be dangerous even in the AFC because the thing is, if you have a quarterback and you can win those ugly defensive battles, you know, that kind of is a little bit different from, you know, some of these other AFC teams in the hunt right now. So, or at least those defensive games let you kind of put you in the running, you know. So like we saw, a team like the Bills, you know, they made it to the AFC Championship. Their defense wasn't that great. You know, could a Steelers team with a good quarterback beat a team like the Bills in one game in the playoffs? Probably. We've seen it. They've seen them upset the Bills before. So, I think Pittsburgh would be interesting with Stafford. But I don't know. What do you think about just these two guys?
I mean, it's a 5-year age difference. Stafford will be 42 in December. Rodgers will be 42 in December. Stafford's 37. I think overall, Stafford's had a better last few years, even with the injury to Rodgers. And I think Aaron wasn't as bad last year as I think we made it out to be. You look at the final numbers, you look at what he did in certain spots. Now, yeah, he had the Denver game, and there were certain games when he looked really, really bad. But I think at the end of the year, he's going to be a okay addition and nothing more than that to any team. Like when I hear Pittsburgh, I say, okay, 80-1 actually sounds good because I don't think it's going to be Russ. I don't necessarily believe they're just going to say Fields just because Tomlin's seen it. And if he liked what he saw, he would have already said, okay, that might be the direction. He hasn't even hinted at that. So I think he's probably scared to put all of his eggs in that basket. So I think a Stafford to Pittsburgh would probably make it the most interesting to me of any of the quarterbacks. And that's even talking about, we just went through this and said we didn't want to go into the AFC because of obviously all that, garbage and having to go through all those guys. But the 80-1 price with the defense and, to me, Stafford is the interesting play there. It's worth a few dollars, I think, as just an investment point on Pittsburgh at the moment. Do I think it's going to go above 80-1? I don't necessarily think that, especially because we're in the season of adding players more than we are probably getting rid of players on that roster. So I think 80 might be close to a ceiling. That's the way I tend to look at this. So I like that price, but I think Stafford is a much better add for any team. I agree with your pocket thing you said before about Stafford, especially this past season. I also think he's getting it out quicker. I think he's getting it out quicker, and I think and maybe this is crazy, but how much, maybe Cooper Kupp was a little bit of a reason why we were seeing certain things. Like maybe he's more toast than we think, than we know. I think there's certain things I'm willing to look at when it comes to Stafford in the last year or so, and I think there's more there. I think there's a chance he can help.
If the Rams could have blocked Jalen Carter on one of two plays, we might not be talking about the Eagles as the Super Bowl winner. I mean, the Rams came this close to being the Eagles, and granted, they got help from some weather and some Jalen Hurts. I don't know what it was, rust, uncertain, indecisiveness, weather issues, injury issues, whatever. But that's the point. Like Stafford with the Rams at least has shown that they have upside, right? So that's why I still say Stafford probably is the most valuable on the Rams. But I think Pittsburgh is interesting because it would give him a better defense than he's ever had. And you probably still have to get another receiver. You'd have to get somebody to get the ball out quick too, because Pickens is not that guy. Obviously, he's a downfield guy. But yeah, I'm sure they'd use Freiermuth better and whatnot. So yeah, it's intriguing.
All right. Let's keep moving here. So this topic to me is kind of fascinating, and it's a great just sentence to say, but it's trying to figure out who's next year's Eagles, basically. Like who's the team that pretty decent, good run, haven't gotten there yet that we think is going to do it now. Now, I kind of want to set this whole thing up with a bit of a stat. I gave this out on the favorites before the Super Bowl, but I think it's worth probably repeating now. So let's say every August for the last 10 years, you bet every single combination of teams at 12-1 or shorter, basically parlaying all the conference title odds as a combo. So over the last 10 years, that strategy has won 4 times across 67 total combinations. Last year with the Chiefs and Eagles, along with the Chiefs and Niners and Bucks and Chiefs, and Pats and Rams. So 67 total combos, 4 winning parlays, 63 losers. Basically, over the last decade, you would be up about 21 units just doing this blind round robin strategy of those 12-1 or shorter Super Bowls. Now, one step further would be, what if you just bet the teams to win the Super Bowl? 12-1 or shorter entering the season. Last decade, 56 total teams, so 56 total bets. It's won 9 of 10 times and lost 47. You would be up about 30 units after having both the Eagles and the Chiefs in the title game. Now, for what it's worth, in 2014, which is 11 years back, Patriots won at plus 650. In 2013, Seahawks won at 8-1. And then 2012 was the outlier, which is basically 18-1 for Baltimore, which starts more of a long stretch. So I think the question is, now remember, these are 12-1 or shorter entering the season. So right now, if you have a team that's Pittsburgh at 80-1 and they make a huge move and they somehow get to 12-1, they would be a part of this list. So it is entering the season. But I think what it says is that you got a lot of good teams that can only make it through the gauntlet. And that's what we've seen, at least recently. The only outlier is that Eagles team with Nick Foles 40-1 entering that season.
Yeah, and so the teams, just to be clear, the teams on the list: Philly, KC, Buffalo, Baltimore, Detroit, and then is that it? That's what I'm saying. Like, it depends. That is it.
Right? And then if you keep going, it would be San Francisco, Cincinnati, and Washington. Those are the teams kind of right on the edge.
Right. So so right now we're looking at 5 teams. I do think San Francisco, depending on how their offseason goes, they'll probably jump into that. I think the Bengals were just kind of always going to be a little skeptical because they just have how they managed their roster in the past at times. But focusing on those top 5 teams, I think that your question was, what kind of one player change can put a team back there? I think that the closest thing is there's no real team on that list where it's obvious except a team that's already been there. But looking at what happened in this Super Bowl, Kansas City, they need a left tackle, right? So I'm looking at, okay, can Kansas City get a Ronnie Stanley, somebody to just shore up that position, kick Tooney back inside to guard like that. Everything else with Kansas City, you're not worried, right? Like you'll figure it out. You got Mahomes, but it was clear that before we were saying, okay, Kansas City, as long as they got Mahomes, Reed, Spagnuolo, they're good. But we saw it with the Tampa Bay Super Bowl, and now we've seen it with the Eagles Super Bowl. They need to be able to block for Mahomes at least a little bit. So I think that's probably the one guy, or I think Ronnie Stanley is the best tackle available. But just any tackle that fortifies that position for Kansas City. And then there's teams outside that list. I think Myles Garrett to Washington could be interesting. They needed a pass rush. They got a quarterback. They got Lattimore. They got some cap space, so they will fill other holes. But outside of that, I think Detroit getting a corner, or maybe even 2, could be big. Because I think their defense everyone was like, kind of puking on their defense down the stretch last year. They got a lot of talented players on that defense, right? Like Aiden Hutchinson, the linebackers, the safety branch, the safeties. Like there's a lot of pieces there. But they want to play man coverage. They need an elite guy or even 2, and they have the 10th most cap space. But my question would be, like, who? Because they had Carlton Davis already. Maybe it's Ward, Reed. I mean, they've been elite at times. Rasul Douglas more of a zone guy. Maybe somebody ascends to that spot. So I think Detroit could make a move that would put them in that, could be the difference. But I just don't necessarily know if we know who that player is. Like, maybe do they trade up for like a Will Johnson, even a Hunter, do they get Morrison? Like, it might just be somebody we don't know yet. But I think Detroit would be the closest thing to like one player away outside of Kansas City getting fortifying that left tackle spot.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to say Buffalo because I felt like they were really close in a number of areas, but I just don't know if the player is available other than maybe like Miles Garrett going to Buffalo, but I don't necessarily know if that's the absolute difference. I think it's an interesting thought process. I wrote down the Detroit corners. I mean, Byron Murphy, DJ Reed were two players I thought were half interesting, but I agree that they're going to miss a lot this offseason. I think they're going to, between the coordinators and a few exits of players,
brain drain,
like there's going to be a lot of trying to fill holes, which scares me a little bit, even though I love so much else on that team. I think the other big one is like T. Higgins, but I don't necessarily think T. Higgins is going to go to a team that matters in this sense. Like I wish I could put him on Buffalo, or I wish I could put him on like some of these teams that probably could use more of a solid wide receiver in that sense, like Baltimore. Like there's these teams to me are kind of missing one of those major guys. I don't know if it's the absolute difference between them getting to the Super Bowl or not, but we're kind of trying to plug some holes here. So yeah, T. Higgins, Miles Garrett. I wrote down Josh Sweat and Khalil Mack as like two options that can just make your team tougher to deal with. But I just don't think that Saquon Barkley is like available. So I think you're trying to play a little bit of checkers and chess to figure out, okay, what's the hole? What's the one or two holes that are the biggest? And like, where is that addition? And I mean, is it going to be a rookie? I have a hard time feeling like anyone but a quarterback can have that type of impact. And if you're taking up in the draft like Tennessee or Cleveland or the Giants, New England, Jacksonville, like we don't think you're getting into this zone anyway. So I think it's a little bit difficult aside from the names I just said, but I do think Miles Garrett has the, potential to be that. And then, Cleveland would get the haul and we'd kind of move on from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of go back to Kansas City adding a tackle, because it's like, let's say Buffalo adds Miles Garrett, but Kansas City adds a tackle. Who are you taking? You know what I mean?
Yeah, Kansas City.
You're still taking Kansas City. I mean, most people would. I mean, people hate Kansas City. So maybe if they're betting with their hearts, they would take Buffalo. But yeah, the pick would be Kansas City.
All right. Well, I think that's an interesting conversation. I feel like next year's Eagles and, the additions and this and that kind of becomes like a weekly thing at this point to see where free agency ends up. But we'll leave it there. And we're going to go one more prop here. So I saw this up at a few books, and I just think it's an interesting conversation point before we get out of here, which is, will the Super Bowl winner be a first-time winner? So I looked at the odds. I see plus 190 for yes, minus 240 for no. Now, just to be clear, the yes options, and I'm just going to list off a bunch of teams here: Arizona, Atlanta, Buffalo. Buffalo is in big letters there. That's a nice one. Carolina, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, Houston, Jacksonville, Chargers, Minnesota, Tennessee. So those are your yes options. So I'll let you attack this first. Do you feel like at plus 190, having, let's call it Buffalo, Cincinnati, Detroit, and Houston with some of the other teams, is it worth it to you?
To me, no, because, and I'm going to break this down. This is my thought process.
Sure.
So yes, the teams that I'm really excited for, if I take that yes, are Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Detroit. And then you got some longer shots, Minnesota, maybe some Houston. The Chargers, you can never count them out. Good coach, good quarterback. But that's the extent of the yeses for me. So some good teams in there, but no gives you Philly, KC, Baltimore, San Francisco, Green Bay, Washington. And you still got, other teams that are pretty good that just longer shots because they're still in that more wild card mix, but like Tampa Bay, maybe the Rams, depending on what they do at quarterback. Dallas was winning 12 games a year, up until last year. So I put an LOL next to them, but I mean, some people maybe would say Dallas. But here's the thing to me. The last 6 Super Bowls, first of all, you had 2 of the same matchups twice. So you had Kansas City, San Francisco twice. You had Philly, Kansas City twice. The Chiefs have been to 5 of the last 6. And then it's been, the Rams, Bucks, and Bengals have each gone once, and, the Niners and Eagles twice. So there hasn't been a lot of teams. Most of those teams are in the no. So if I'm betting on a new winner, I think I'm just going back to what we talked about previously. Like, I'm just going to bet Buffalo, Cincinnati, Detroit, whoever I think among those teams, or, if I think it's a longer shot, even better. Like, I just think you have more upside from a betting perspective, just betting the team or teams that you think will be those winners than betting like plus 190. That's just not long enough odds for me to say yes. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not long enough, especially because I feel like my best shots potentially are in the AFC, which doesn't do me
Yeah.
too much good. And then I'm running with Detroit and Minnesota, maybe. And at that point, I'd rather just get the 8-1, 9-1, and then the 30-1 or so. I think it's probably just the easier way to attack it because even with the plus 190, I just don't feel like I'm getting enough teams that can even get up into that zone to make the value worth it. And there's just too many teams at the top of the draft too. So that is my thought process as well. But I do think getting some of those teams now before they get some of these moves off, like I do think the 30-1 Minnesotas and things of that nature is worth looking at because I just don't think they can be done based off of what happened last year. So, we talked about Pittsburgh as well. Yeah.
I got a quick question for you. So we mentioned there's only like 5 teams right now that are 12-1 or shorter. I know you've gone back and looked at this. Like, what is the general, how many teams on average are usually in that 12-1 range? Is it always 5 or less? I feel like it's usually a few more than that, right?
It's usually in the like 6-ish range.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it's much more than that. I think the biggest thing is teams tend to move into that range later. Like I know a bunch of people that got Philly at like 18-1. But by the time we got to the season, the hype had turned and they were 12-1. That's where they closed. So I do think San Francisco and like if Cincinnati, Washington, or Green Bay has some addition, there's a very good chance they will fall into that zone. I think other than that, you've got your 5 or 6 teams.
And I'm just going to shout out a team that I think is really good. I thought they were really good last year. I don't know exactly what they'd have to do, but I feel like they're not as far off as people think. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Okay.
Baker Mayfield now has done it with 2 different coordinators. Over the last 2 years, he keeps getting better and better in this offense. They got a great offense, and the defense still has pieces. If they make like a move or two, or just get a rookie or two that on defense who levels them up a ton, like I don't know if the market would respect them, but I'm just going to put it this way: they're a team that I think is going to be underrated, and I wouldn't have been surprised if they hadn't got upset by Washington, if they had gone a lot deeper into the playoffs. It's just the nature of the NFC. It is kind of random like that, but I wouldn't sleep on a team like the Buccaneers. At least I'm not going to sleep on them. I think they're pretty good. That offense is just ridiculous.
And they also did something I didn't think they could do, which gives me more confidence in the future, which is they really replaced Chris Godwin after the injury decently well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I really thought that injury was going to decimate what was of their offense and the confidence and the swagger and the way Baker played. And it didn't really have that impact. So assuming he's great. And I want to just say that. And that's why I thought the impact would be larger, but it makes me believe in whatever they're going to do next. I'm not the biggest Todd Bowles guy. But if
he just he's
but
a
you're right.
Guy. And
correct.
You asked me who's the Saquon Barkley.
Sure.
Who you can add Bucky Irving. Who's the most like Saquon Barkley? Like in all the metrics, right? We're quoting all postseason. It's like you got Saquon Barkley and then you got Bucky Irving. So just a team to watch. Just throwing it out there. Probably a long shot. Doesn't really fit the 12-1 thing, but I just wonder if they make some moves or something. I could see them jumping up a little bit. So just a team I'm keeping an eye on.
The other one I thought was interesting, and then we can get out of here, to me is just the conversation around Houston. So there was so much hype last year with Houston. Like they made all those moves. They went down to like 15-1 from like 200-1 the year before. So they end up closing last year at like 14-1 range. They're 28-30-1 now. So like if you believed in Houston last year and you look at that division, to me, that's a little long for the talent on the roster, the injuries that they had, and the potential to even add some players to that mix. So I think Houston, just from let's look at last year's odds, look at this year's odds, and kind of look at the roster, it's a little intriguing. That's all.
Yeah, it still looks like the worst division in football. So somebody's going to be a long shot in that division. Could get interesting. I mean, Tennessee gets a quarterback. Who knows? If Anthony Richardson remembers how to throw a football. It's just that division is another one I think to watch. But again, it's just when you come back to the AFC, it's always like, oh man,
it's impossible.
Got to deal with the Bengals and the Chiefs and whatnot. But yeah, I totally agree.
All right. Well, that is episode number 1 of the NFL Draft, NFL Offseason. We are going to be back Tons and tons of content to do. I can't wait for all these markets to pop up. But that'll do it for the Action Network podcast for some NFL draft and offseason talk. I'll be back later this week to talk Academy Awards betting for my guy Colin Witcher, so stay tuned for that. Don't forget to download the free award-winning Action Network app to see more from all our Action Network contributors. Plus, you can track your own picks. Also, check out the Action Network Discord server to chop it up with experts and fellow gamblers for not just NFL, NBA, college hoops, and also during live events too. There's a link to join in the description of the pod. Plus, if you want to tail any of the bets given out on Action Network's family of podcasts, be sure to check out actionnetwork.com/betnow for quick slip links that let you tail instantly when available. All right. See you later, guys. Enjoy.